Good morning, everybody. I'm Alexa Chapivsky, the Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. On behalf of our WFPG board and staff, we warmly welcome you to today's timely discussion, focusing on today's most urgent issues affecting our international security order. The WFPG is committed to advancing women's leadership in international affairs and to amplifying their voices through substantive global issue discussions and mentoring. Since our founding over 25 years ago, the WFPG has worked tirelessly to expand the foreign policy dialogue across political divides and generations, and to support women at every stage of their careers. At the WFPG, we believe that increasing diversity at all levels of policymaking is crucial to both bolstering gender equality and to building a more peaceful and more prosperous world. If you are not already a member, please join us. We have an exciting calendar of programming opportunities and mentor-mentee opportunities planned ahead for 2023. Events for our members around, for example, female Nobel Peace Prize laureates in person here in DC, around opportunities and challenges in connection with climate change, around diversity and inclusion in national security and defense, an event around newly arrived to Washington female ambassadors and DCMs. So a lot of exciting programming ahead. We encourage you, please join today if you're not already a member. And without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our moderator today, who will in turn introduce our esteemed panelists. Saleha Mohsin is Senior Washington Correspondent for Bloomberg. Saleha has a storied global career. Most recently, she has been covering US economic statecraft of the past year, the US's economic response to Russia's invasion. Saleha also has a book forthcoming on the weaponization of the dollar. It is scheduled for release in March 2024 by Penguin Random House. Without further ado, Saleha, thank you so much for captaining our ship today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jill, for such a lovely, or Alexis, for such a lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm so honored to be here. I'm very excited about today's topic. We've got the Munich Security Conference coming up. I've got colleagues who are already in the air and traveling with Vice President Kamala Harris, heading over there to cover what's going to happen. So let's jump into it. I'd like to introduce our delightful panelists today. We have Olha Stefanishyna. She is the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. We're also fortunate to have Andrea Thompson. She is currently the Vice President for International Programs at Northrop Grumman. And we also have with us today Ambassador Dobriansky, who has been a foreign policy expert and a diplomat for many, many years. She's currently a senior fellow in the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard University. I'd like to kick off today's discussion with our Deputy Prime Minister, Ms. Stefanishyna. I'd like to ask you, can you share with us a little bit about how Ukraine's increasingly close ties with organizations like the European Union and NATO, how has that been important to Ukraine this past year?
Well, thank you so much, and greetings to all the attendees and panelists. It's a great pleasure for me to have this discussion today. Well, I think the answer is relatively clear to everybody. In living in a full-scale war also requires additional efforts, a part of fighting on a battlefield, to keep people united and mobilized. And the idea of European and Euro-Atlantic integration is exactly the stimulation which allows people to keep united and motivated over doing everything they can to build a better and prosperous future of Ukraine when the war is over and when Ukraine wins in this war. And every step of this way causes additional element of mobilization around people. In fact, more than 90% of Ukrainians support Ukraine's joining to European Union. And basically, every time the decision like granting Ukraine the candidate status, advancing with the accession talks is taken, it mobilizes us politicians to step up united on the reforms agenda, and it keeps the energy among people, knowing that the country is running, the country is moving despite the war. And of course, it causes a lot of positive emotions also within armed forces, because being on a battlefield, fighting for their families, fighting for their way of life, fighting for the independence of Ukraine, also gives the understanding that this fight is also aligned with the very sustainable steps to build Ukraine we all fighting for in time of war.
So we are gathered here to talk about the conference that's ahead. Can you share a little bit about what it is about this conference that's important, and how you see the gathering influencing foreign policy in the months ahead?
Well, basically, we all remember the Munich speech of Vladimir Putin in 2007, and basically now in 2022 and 23, we see the consequences of this messaging and neglecting of this messaging by a democratic world, and showing strategic ambiguity towards decisions like, for example, bringing Ukraine to NATO back in 2008 has led it to the reality we all face right now. So I think that the particular discussion which will be taking place over the Munich Security Conference around the leaders is the way to let's say reconsider the security policies and reconsider the way how we have been protecting our democracies, our way of life. And unfortunately, with a full-scale war started on 24th of February, it became clear to everybody that strong armies, a strong defense capacity, and strong defense industry are back into the reality of our political agenda. And to protect our ways of life, we also should be prepared militarily, not only by building the rules and the standards of democratic world. So I think that, and I hope that over the upcoming days, Munich Security Conference could become, in this year in particular, could become a historic meeting which would pave the way towards the strategic decisions on the security architecture. We remember that the last year, just 2 days before the full-scale invasion, President Zelensky addressed the leaders at the Munich Security Conference, warning about the consequences of potential aggression of Russian Federation. And we see that all this forecast has been materialized. So I hope that the address of the president of Ukraine over the Munich Security Conference will be also taken seriously. It would also pave the way towards a historical positive consequences on ending the war, but also rebuilding the European security architecture with the understanding of this new reality where we have a full-scale war on the territory of the largest European country and continent.
For just a minute, I want to turn to Andrea. Since we are talking about all of the help that we've seen come through for for Ukraine to go against Russia and maintain the global order that has been so sensitively and preciously guarded for so many years. Andrea, can you talk to us a little bit about the United States and its allies in the G7, how they have lent their collective defense industry prowess, and in this conflict and in others, but this one, of course, gives the starkest example. What is their role in geopolitics and foreign policy, and how do we see that coming through in the conference in the next couple of days?
Thanks, Leah, and thanks to the panelists. Madam Minister, thank you for your steadfast leadership in leading the country at war, and for Ambassador Dobriansky, for Paula, for your partnership through the years during my time at State Department and now in industry. So Leah, you raise a great point, and I think it segues nicely with the remarks from Madam Minister that we're seeing that some of that muscle has atrophied. We're seeing some countries that, quite frankly, have not committed to a robust defense, their defense industry, And we're seeing the impact of that. The good news is this is, a small silver lining that comes through the horrific side of war, is countries have recognized and leaders have recognized the importance to doing that. So you saw the remarks continually, and as recently as this week with the Secretary General, on the commitment of the 2% and reminding people that's a floor, not a ceiling, 2% of the GDP. And calling out our NATO partners that are showing the example. For example, Poland is up to, I believe it's up to about 4% of their gross domestic product in commitment to defense. Estonia, I think, is going to reach 3% this year. But what underscores all of that is the alliance, and this has been a forcing function. And I'm certain we'll get into it in some of the Q&A. We have shown that the brittle, I would say, kind of antiquated foreign military sales process and acquisition process of the United States that we all recognize needs to evolve. The war in Ukraine has shown us that we can be agile, and how do we sustain that? The agility of getting the much needed weapons to the front lines in Ukraine, getting the training, getting the resources, getting the supplies moved forward. And not only within the United States, but as we're seeing, we are better together. We're better when we have the strength of the NATO alliance and, quite candidly, our other partners in across the region, to include the Indo-Pacific. They are evolving their processes. They're getting the equipment where we need, and we're looking introspectively in industry on what can we do, or what should we do to ensure that we push those weapons forward quickly, the weapons that are much needed, and what can we do to increase those arsenals back at home and abroad. Again, I'm certain we'll talk about China this morning. We got to be able to do both sides, and that discussion is occurring. It occurred earlier this week in the defense communities with Secretary Austin, and I would anticipate that would be a question or discussion point at the conference this week as well.
Andrea, you mentioned resources. Can you tell us a little bit about how important is new technology? How important are cyber attacks and AI in these conflicts that we're seeing, not just in Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world, Iran, Peru, Taiwan, to name a couple?
Great point. That was one of my other notes is, although I don't think it'll be a main message at the Munich Security Conference, I think it will be in some of the sidebar bilateral discussions and some of those more technical discussions off the main stage. And that's the importance of technology and sharing that technology, whether it's AI, quantum, and other emerging technologies. I would like to note, we'd started the discussion about raising a Cybersecurity and Emerging Technologies Bureau in the State Department 4 years ago. It'll be 5 years ago in June that we initiated that discussion with the Secretary. And it just sparked much joy when I saw that Secretary Blinken and his team was able to make that a reality. So we're talking not only the technical, recruiting and retaining and building up our cyber forces, but cyber diplomacy. And what does that mean? So we're having those discussions in NATO circles, in the EU, across the Indo-Pacific, and growing that next generation of leadership, because we don't have those policy experts as we should. You've seen the articles. I think it's 600,000 shortfall in the cyber community. We can do more efficient in our defense industry by using technology. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that now as we build digital twins before we launch an aircraft into flight. We're seeing in Ukraine by using more highly advanced, you use less munitions because they're more precise. So this will be a discussion at the Munich Security Conference. It must be a discussion at the Munich Security Conference. And this isn't just a US phenomenon, this is a global phenomenon.
Ambassador Dobriansky, if I can turn to you, we've heard from Madam Minister and now Andrea as well about the role of diplomacy as we look at intergovernmental security networks. Can you expand on that? What does diplomacy, what does negotiation, and what does economic statecraft and other kinds of statecraft do in knitting together global security networks?
Well, first, I want to thank the Women's Foreign Policy Group for hosting us this morning, and I'm delighted to be with also Madam Minister and with Andrea as well, a longtime colleague and friend, and also glad to have you, Saleha, guide us along this morning. It's an excellent question. Diplomacy does matter, and I'd start with this. I thought that the Madam Minister was very right in raising the issue of 2007, because back in 2007, when Putin came forward and made his speech at the Munich Security Conference, it was a blueprint for the actions that he would follow on. And we see it right up to the present. And she's right to remind us on this occasion, because it is 1 year out from the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Here, diplomacy has mattered greatly, because when there was on February 24, the invasion of Ukraine, diplomacy in the context of NATO, in the context of the EU, multilaterally, bilaterally, really has been crucial. Crucial in terms of, first of all, coming together and establishing a consensus around the assessment of the threat at hand, also a discussion about the kinds of concrete steps that can be taken and how unity of purpose would in fact matter. I would say here that I think the administration, the Biden administration on diplomacy has been very, very engaged. Very engaged in terms of its outreach, particularly in terms of Europe, but not just only Europe. Here also, the Indo-Pacific has mattered. Andrea raised the issue of China, which looms large also in this equation. And here, there have been countless discussions with many of our close partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, among others, in terms of the kinds of steps that now need to be taken militarily, economically, politically, relative to Ukraine, because what happens in Ukraine is not just going to affect Ukraine, which it already has, but the security concerns are great for Europe at large and the transatlantic relationship, and also the global community, in particular the Indo-Pacific. Those like Xi Jinping are watching specifically what kinds of outcomes will occur here and what that will mean for what steps, aggressive steps that he will take vis-a-vis Taiwan. So back to your core question, diplomacy matters here. I think it has provided as I said, in particular, a kind of unity of purpose and assessment of what is the threat that we are confronted with, the situation in Ukraine, how it also has played out here, how we can together, not singularly, but together militarily assist Ukraine. And here Zelensky has been very clear about the kinds of assistance that is needed right up to the present time, with his pronouncement of long-range artillery, ammunition, and especially aircraft, the F-16s. And then also here, sanctions. You put sanctions in the mix here, and sanctions are key because sanctions also matter, not just from the governmental side, but also from the private sector side, in terms of what kind of impact we can have in stemming the tide of the kind of military onslaught on Ukraine. So diplomacy factors in here, and certainly even in the context of the Munich Security Conference, here you have defense officials coming together, but you also have those many from the State Department, from the diplomatic community, who are there and who will maximize on this opportunity to talk about the current situation, where we are and what we need to do.
Before I turn back to Madam Minister, I just want to welcome any latecomers in our audience to the Zoom session. This is the Munich Security Conference preview, the international order, Ukraine and other top priorities. I also want to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A portion, so I would love to see some questions coming in. We'll turn to those in a little bit. Madam Minister, I wanted to turn back to you. We are here, of course, with the Women's Foreign Policy Group, so we have to touch on the very important issue of gender equality. I understand you've done some work in Ukraine on gender equality. I'd like to hear about that work and how that has changed in the context of the war of the past year.
I think that with the full-scale aggression beginning, the major shift was from to those who can overtake the responsibility of taking actions in its specific direction wherever it is needed. And this kind of like issue related to access of women to politics, to various professions, including military, has simply evaporated for some period of time, because basically the first and ultimate understanding that everybody who can undertake the responsibility on their direction are there, and this has not been subjected to any gender-based decision. But of course, the war has significantly affected women and children, because most of them had to leave. Around 6.5 million of people, most of them are women and children. They had to leave out the country and start basically building their lives from the scratch, escaping from the atrocities of war, escaping from occupation, and trying to keep their families safe. So, and this has been the most massive movement of people around the area. But I'm particularly proud that the basis we have managed to build in terms of building the gender equality policy in Ukraine, including issues related to fight against and prevention of domestic violence, they have been very instrumental and in times of war, because basically before the full-scale war started, we have opened the access for women's in all the military professions. So it has been very limited. So when the war started, there were no limits, legal and physical, for women to step up shoulder to shoulder with the men in the army in various professions. And this has been a major shift on our side, as well as all the infrastructure of shelters for women, for different vulnerable categories of people, which have been developed before the full-scale war, was very useful in terms of giving access and placement to people who were escaping the war, but also the work we've been building from the medical point of view, from the psychological point of view, has been very useful to these vulnerable groups of people. But still, we are now bringing ourselves back to the streamlined policy in this area, and of course we are also focusing on those people who face sexual violence and abuse in times of war, and mostly, of course, these are the women's, younger children, elderly, older women's, and this has unfortunately been a massive situation in occupied areas. It has been part of the war methodology, let's say, of the Russian Federation, and it's a targeted method of comprehensive demoralization of population in occupied areas. And of course, we have also massively tackled this issue. So we opened the survivor centers throughout the country, providing help, support, medical, psychological, and social to these people who have unfortunately faced these war crimes from the Russian Federation who affected them. So many new dimensions occurred, and unfortunate but very important experience and lessons we're learning from that. But at the same time, women's got much more and greater access to the decision-making process, because still the majority of men are serving in the armed forces, and basically women are still able to participate in a political life. So this access has increased because there is again a demand for responsibility to be overtaken. And as some of the women leaders in the past were saying, if you want something to be done, ask a woman. And basically this has been the case in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think off the top of my head, it's Maggie Thatcher who said something like what you said. If you want something done, ask a busy woman to do it and she'll get it done. You're absolutely right, Madam Minister. I want to ask you also, so climate crisis, the global health crisis, democracies, this is all backsliding. And this was highlighted in last year's Munich Security Index. And I'd like to hear from you, what kind of advocacy is needed to help how these issues particularly affect women? How do we protect, what kind of policies would help protect these vulnerable populations?
Again, it should be like a sustainable policy making process, but not rather crisis management. And building sustainable policies, state programs, allocation of financial resources to various vulnerable groups, giving them the opportunity for business self-development and eliminating loopholes for discrimination. These are the major goals, which has been the success case to Ukraine. But what I also wanted to say that this is exactly the backsliding in various areas and putting them back in the agenda is one of the major targets of the war Russia has launched in Ukraine as a more in a broader sense, geopolitical war. And that's why when we're talking about stepping up and advancing the peace plan of the President Zelensky of 10 points, which includes environmental, climate security issue, nuclear security issue, food security issues. This is the meaning where when Russian Federation will be defeated, when we will be forming a sustainable agenda, how to mitigate these risks of the war. And the deeper Russian Federation is getting into the war in Ukraine, the longer the war is lasting, the more backsliding we will face in various areas, because this is the major historical destabilization around Europe and the globe caused by this war. So ending the war would mean restoring back the sustainable agenda, which affect by the end of the day all the people around the globe. So our understanding that stepping up with the peace efforts also include sustainable policies in these areas.
I want to turn to Ambassador Dobriansky. You wrote in April of last year a piece for the Wall Street Journal. You write that helping Ukraine win against Russia is vital to NATO interest. I wonder if you could expand on this idea a little bit more and tell us about the security risks that the invasion from last year posed to the international order that as we know it now, or as we knew it last year.
Sure. Well, as the Deputy Prime Minister had said, she had mentioned how Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. It's also at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. And when there's instability, and as we've witnessed, not only the aggression that took place in 2014, but in the, starting February 24 last year, that kind of insecurity and instability is going to have a major impact, which it has in terms of the security of Europe and also the global community. How so? We've witnessed not only in terms of energy, how they're through a weaponization of energy by Moscow, how that has impacted all. Energy affects our daily lives, from just regular daily things up to also the need for fuel for our aircraft, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a direct correlation there. Secondly is also food security. We've seen with the kind of decimation that has taken place and of the infrastructure and the blockage at the ports, how many countries are impacted. Egypt being one. Some 75% of Egypt's grain is from Ukraine. And also, by the way, China gets a very substantial portion of its grain from Ukraine. So here you have those considerations, but also just from a military standpoint. Countries like Poland, the Visegrad countries, the countries in Central Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, they're all very concerned because of also what they've witnessed. And this goes back to the Madam Minister's statement about Putin in 2007. He actually stated that, well, we have a right to take this kind of action. And we've seen the aggression in obviously in Georgia, in Ossetia, also in Moldova, and no less in Ukraine in 2014. So the great concern here is with the destabilization, the war in Ukraine, it has already had a direct impact on the security and on the functioning of many countries, not just only in Europe, but around the globe, and our supply chains. But secondly, in a military context, there is a great concern. The concern is, and the two examples, and I'll end on this, one, the Baltic states have been attacked. Estonia was attacked with a cyber attack. So was Ukraine before. We've witnessed this kind of aggression, whether it's by cyber or with armed forces, or little green men, as was the case in Crimea, as it was told. And the concern also is, and I referenced it before, of what kind of signal this sends if this kind of aggression is not stemmed. It does destabilize the international order into one of lawlessness, a lack of respect for rule of law, for sovereignty, all of the above. And it gives a go-ahead for countries and like Xi Jinping of China to say, well, okay, I can move forward in Taiwan. That is the grave concern here, and one which I would say that not just the transatlantic community, but many members of the global community have been very concerned about the destabilization here and its global impact.
Andrea, I wonder if you could answer this one for us. I wonder, how do you think the attack on Ukraine affects the idea of democracy around the world? There's a lot of data out there about how autocracies are increasing and maybe democracies are falling by the wayside. I'm not sure where we are on that right now, but do you think it is the international community's responsibility to defend the name of democracy through this war?
Well, as Ambassador Dobriansky just addressed, if we don't stand again as an alliance for rules-based international order, democracy in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, what signal do we send to China and with Taiwan? And at the end of the day, it is the right thing to do. You can call it democracy, you can call it rules-based international order, you can put whatever label that you need to put on it. It is the right thing to do. When a sovereign nation is invaded, we as an international organization, and as those democratic and others, need to push back and stand up for what is right. So, is democracy falling by the wayside? I don't think so. But we do need, it does set precedent, it does set an example. So we need to stand strong. You've heard it again from the administration, you've heard it from the Secretary General, you've heard it from every world leader minus about 4 or 5, that we are in this for the long haul. We're in this together. It's the right thing to do. We need to figure out the resources. We have to talk about what we each can bring to this fight, whether it's military, whether it's diplomatic, whether it's economic. We all need to roll up our sleeves and contribute to this. And we're seeing, again, countries that I was almost 30 years in the Army. In my time in the military, there are countries that are in the alliance contributing that I never would have thought would have stepped up to the level that they have to date. So the evolution of the alliance is strengthened. I've deployed on NATO operations during my time in the military, and I believed in it then, and I believe it even more so in it now.
Saleha, may I just add something, if it's okay? If I wanted to add something here, just 2 points. It's very interesting when we look back prior to all that has unfolded. Some have argued and said that there was a little bit of complacency within in the NATO alliance, complacency even among democracies, of taking a little bit for granted of what we are. And if I could say, there is really very, to use the word silver lining, given the atrocity and the brutality of what's taking place. But I will say it has galvanized, I think, democracies who really want to really fight against this, because it does take down the kind of international order of respect for other countries. And in this case, I think we have seen somewhat of a rejuvenation, actually, and a feeling of we must stand up and counter this, because if you don't, then not just only China, but other countries, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, those that have not respected democratic principles, they will march forward. And, you know, one last point, it's also very striking. This particular Munich Security Conference is going to take place when, by the way, there are to be 2 new members of NATO. And if you had asked me, and you know, years ago, would I have thought that Finland or Sweden were going to be part of NATO? No. And in this case, it just underscores even your question. They joined in, and not only because of the threat and what it means for them, but also because of the very principles that they see being torn down here.
Yeah, those are very interesting points. And before we kind of move on with that specific thread, I just want to remind the audience that I will in a few minutes be turning to Q&A. So please use the Q&A function on the Zoom app to send through some questions. But taking those comments from Ambassador Dobriansky, Madam Minister, I wonder if we can turn back to you for a moment, because when we look at democracy, you know, a huge component of that is social cohesion. And we do see social incohesion comes from economic difficulties. And we're seeing now that because of the war, there's food shortages, mass migration because of this. The overall concern around the world as these basic needs, you know, energy, food, and where you live, these basic commodities and needs are being affected, are damaging the happiness of people, which is going to affect democracy. I wonder if you can tell us, do you think that there's been enough of an active effort in the world to address social incohesion and some of these other more core issues of food shortages, mass migration, and climate change through policy and legislation so far?
Well, I think that the effort were really massive, and I think that the first very systematic decision was taken by adopting the Sustainable Development Goal at the UN, which really had a global and massive effect around the world, and each and every country has been building its own strategy based on this Sustainable Development Goals, including the social cohesion issues, addressing the poverty, addressing the issue of access to basic needs and services. And I think this is the first very sustainable decision which has been taken in Ukraine. We've been building on this, our policies, and it has played a very significant role here in our country. But I also want to bring your attention to the country we've managed to build since 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity has ended, and we started to targetedly address our European aspirations. For all of this year, we've been building on the values of our nation as a nation with a long history. We've been working as a government in building this unity among the society, uniting various groups from various parts of the regions of Ukraine. And by the end of the day, when the full-scale war started, it has brought its effect to mobilize the unity among the people. But it's also very interesting to refer to one of the points in the report presented for the Munich Security Conference, which has been endorsed in Berlin with my participation as well on Monday. It refers to the very fact that even if Russians would made a decision and apply nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine, more than 80% of Ukrainian people answered and said that they will keep on standing for their soil and keep on fighting. And this unity is the result of the multi-year investments into the social cohesion of the nation, representing different parts of Ukraine, different languages, different ethnicities, and etc. And I think that this is the basic benchmark showing that the sustainable, proactive policy supporting the better living standards, better permanent transformation and alignment of the policy and the statehood according to the needs of the people, gives its investment in a crucial times, in time of crisis, is not necessarily like the war, but unfortunately this is the experience of Ukraine. So only sustainable policy addressing also those not only national but transnational context, addressing the needs of the most vulnerable countries as well.
I'd like to turn to a question that we have from the audience, from Giovanna Becker. She asks, and I wonder if it's Andrea that we should give this question to, in reference to cyber diplomacy. Giovanna asks, who could be the third party, the most appropriate third party, to help resolve the Ukrainian-Russian war?
Well, great question. So I think in this particular case, cyber diplomacy is one of the tools. Cyber diplomacy isn't going to, stop the war, but it's going to mitigate some risk in the war. I don't think with the war you can't find a third party. I think that the strength of cyber diplomacy in the current context is what it has shown with our alliance, and it's increased transparency and lessons learned and information sharing. We saw that early on in the war, where NATO and the NATO partnership, traditionally you'd have those firewalls where the US wouldn't share that information. We would share it with our Five Eyes community, but you wouldn't share it more broadly, particularly with attribution, because you're putting your techniques, your skills a bit at risk, making it a little more vulnerable when you say, this is, we know we did it. That's one of the other parts of the evolution of cyber diplomacy. You're seeing more and more attribution as an alliance. It used to be, the US, maybe the UK. Now you're seeing other nations going, nope, it was Russia, and here's why we know it was Russia. So again, the upside to this in cyber diplomacy in the context of war, with NATO, it is evolving NATO and what their tools it can bring. The NATO Cyber Center of Excellence in Tallinn in Estonia always had a footprint there, and countries were participating, even more increased participation from the alliance, sending their experts going, Estonia saw this, what did Latvia see? What did Germany see? What did the US see? What did the UK see? What did Ukraine see? And we're also seeing in cyber diplomacy the importance of private industry, that it's not only government to government, but in many cases, the technical experts and those skill sets lie outside of government. So it has been a whole of nation approach where we have said, again, other industries are bringing forward going, this is what we found, or here is a tool that can help to exploit the cyber attacks from Russia and others. We are learning so much in this war that applies not only to the conflict on the ground to date, but will help our nations, our alliance for future wars as well. If, God forbid, but if there is future conflict, that we are so many lessons learned with Russia that I think will apply to China and others.
While we wait for some more audience questions coming in, I've got one of my own. I'm going to stick with Andrea here while we've got you. I was wondering if you could tell us how the invasion affects the inner workings of NATO. Like, yes, of course, as Ambassador Dobriansky highlighted, we have 2 new members and couldn't have imagined that a couple of years ago. But I wonder if you think there should be more emphasis on collaboration between countries, or should there be a door open for more democracies that are more vulnerable to be able to join? How do you think this should be working?
Well, those that know me know that collaboration is a foundational element of my leadership style. My team has heard me say repeatedly, we are better together. I said that when I was undersecretary. I said it during my time in uniform. I say it now in industry. We are better as a nation. We are better as a company. We are better as an alliance when we have the great thought of others coming in and poking holes in the plan, right? I'm a former intelligence officer. And it takes, that's what we bring to this organization is you come forward and go, well, here, let me poke holes in it now and talk about where there's some risks here. So I am finding again, back with the alliance and collaboration, countries, peoples, industries that traditionally would put that firewall up going, I'm not sharing that information with you. It's proprietary to my company, proprietary to my country. I am finding those walls are being broken down because we have seen the strength if we bring all assets to bear, whether it is, again, in war, whether it is with rebuilding a country, whether it is with diplomacy, the greater collaboration and transparency and communication that we share one another will bring us the greatest results.
If we turn away from Ukraine and Russia for just a minute and look a little bit more broadly at global affairs in some other parts of the world, Ambassador Dobriansky, you were Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. You spearheaded relations with India, China, and Brazil through environment, energy, health, development, and humanitarian issues. can you talk to us about what some of the biggest points of contention in these countries, India, China, and Brazil, and what we can do to establish a more unified agenda?
Okay, well, let me start with Brazil. Brazil just had an election, and as we know, it shifted from Bolsonaro, who was very closely aligned with the United States, to President Lula. Here, it remains to be seen what are the core areas of which we will be able to forge a relationship with Brazil. The environmental issue is one of the areas I believe that the Biden administration hopes, given the full range of tropical forests in Brazil and other types of environmental issues, where I think they want to try to reach out. But I'll give you an example of one area that I think will go by the wayside. During Bolsonaro's time, he brought Brazil, and Brazil became what's called a major non-NATO ally. Because as we're talking about security issues, Brazil was actually in that context. And what that means is there was, collaboration, looking at the kinds of security interests. Having said that, let me also add one more detail about Brazil. Brazil, where whether it's been Bolsonaro or now Lula, Brazil actually has a major trade with China in the soybean area. And so, there are areas of collaboration, as I said, and areas where lines are drawn, and that's one of them. Let me go to India next. India is a strategic partner of the United States. We have a very, very close relationship with India. You mentioned in your question before the issue of democracies. I mean, India is the largest democracy, in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, there have been some constraints on the extent of the relationship. Russia is India's #1 arms supplier. Russia also, as we know during this period, is giving and providing India with substantial energy, which we have sanctioned that. So there are some fundamental differences at this time, but at the same time, there's also an extremely close relationship with India. We're part of what's known as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue with India. We run military exercises with them called the Malabar exercises annually. And also significantly here, where we are very aligned with India, Australia, and Japan, is in terms of dealing with China and China as a threat. And finally, let me just say a word on China. We've seen our relationship as being one that's been significantly strained. I think the worst element has been during the pandemic, not only on the lack of transparency, but I would say when many of our companies, a number of our companies that were trying to export out of China, protective personnel equipment, PPEs, they were prevented from doing it. So hence the question has come to the forefront about supply chains. Some have used the term of decoupling. I would say this, my own view is I think we should look at more closely, strategically, those kinds of assets, particularly defense-related assets, which we don't want to have continued manufactured or rely on and have to rely on China. Solar paneling, India provide. I keep saying India. China provides literally has the monopoly on the resources for solar paneling. So finally, here, how does one go forward? I know that the administration had, I think, some intent by Secretary Blinken going out to China, of at least kind of establishing a diplomatic dialogue here. But as we know, there was the red balloon incident, and he's not going. And also even the question arose, did China do this intentionally because they didn't want to have the dialogue? There are experts who say no. There are other experts who say yes. So the core point there, our relationship with China right now is a very strained one, and one in which we are very concerned about their military buildup, but not just that, it's also about their aggression. The aggression, and also the fact that they have blindly come behind Russia in its military invasion of Ukraine. So there are challenges here in these three relationships, I would absolutely say.
We have a great question that just came in. I'm going to ask Madam Minister to field this one for us. There's a lot of global leaders, former heads of states and others who are saying off the record that they are confident that the war will end in a compromise. Madam Minister, I wonder what your response is to that and what the current Ukrainian government position is on that.
Let's be clear, because there are different wording has been mentioned here today. The conflict, the crisis. This is a war launched by Russian Federation against a sovereign country based on no conflict, which has been between our countries since 2014, and then before 24th of February. So there is a clarity from the very beginning, which we all fit in, and as every war ends with the negotiations, this would be the case with Ukraine, but it's equally important for all the democratic countries and all the democratic world that specific preconditions and specific understanding how the war might end are there for next purposes. First, the war should end with understanding that everything which Russia has been doing and the Russian leadership should be brought to accountability. Not any single act related to ending this war should give a signal to other autocracies that they can follow the example of the Russian Federation. And as well, ending the war in Ukraine should lead to building a new, secure and comprehensive security environment around Europe. Under all of these conditions, it's absolutely clear that the war could only end with the victory of Ukraine, with all the support we get through the military, financial resources, through intel exchange, and etc. There is an understanding that basically this is the only option we all have. In fact, Russia has already been defeated and failed to reach any of the declared goals since 24th of February. So whenever we're talking about ending the war, we should not squeeze in everything to sort of a compromise or a negotiation. There is a much broader framework which would definitely affect the whole geopolitics, the whole world, the whole continent as a minimum. So it's very important that whenever we're talking about the victory of Ukraine, it should be taken in a broader context. So based on that, we shaped the 10 points peace plan, and we want to launch the peace summit based on this proposal, which will put together over one table the global leaders from Asia to Washington to set the discussion and set the agenda of ending the war and restoring peace in Europe generally. So and in this context, it's really important that Russia should not be the major player in this discussion. Russia should face the responsibility for the crimes committed. Russia should pay the reparations to Ukraine and European capitals who faced crises over this aggression, and Russia should take its armed forces from the territory of Ukraine before any discussion could only take place. I think based on these three major pillars, there will be a room for more strategic discussion and avoiding other autocracies, including Russia, to have any aggressive appetite to launch the war elsewhere in the world, but as well in Ukraine.
Do you see an opening for this discussion to start sometime this year?
Yeah, we expect to organize the Peace Summit in the very, very nearest future. We have already a full support of the plan and the summit itself by all 27 EU leaders following the recent visit of the President of Ukraine to Brussels. This is also formalized through a document, as well as Great Britain is already in a bunch of this coalition. When we gather a broader engagement, and there will be a readiness, we plan to have this meeting as soon as possible.
Well, everyone, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. It's been a very educational session ahead of the Munich Security Conference. A special thank you to Oleksa Chapivsky, who is the Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, who put together a wonderful panel here. Thank you so much, Madam Minister, for joining us, Ambassador Dobriansky, and Andrea Thompson from Northrop. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.